I think so. We are a few minutes past our scheduled starting time, which I think is enough time on South Asian time to let everybody trickle in and join us, though I'm sure there will be more people on the way. For those of you who are just joining us, um, Gautam, who will be our moderator for today, he has messaged us to say that he got stuck in a really bad traffic jam, so he's running a little bit late, but we're expecting him very soon. But in the meanwhile, I think it's a good opportunity for us to, one, say a very big hello to all of you. My name is Roman. I'm the editor here at Himal Southasian. I'm I'm not going to speak for very long. I think I have colleagues who have worked much harder than I have on putting this particular event together, and I want to hand the floor and the spotlight over to them. What I do want to say is, one, that it's such a pleasure to see such a good turnout. Some familiar names among all the names on Zoom as well, some familiar faces as well. So to friends old and new, thank you for joining us and welcome. I think when we came up with the idea of doing, well, the Fiction Fest for us is in its third year now. But when we came up with the idea of doing a Fiction Fest centered on speculative fiction, which I think maybe even a few years ago would not have sparked a lot of excitement maybe in South Asia. But I think this time around, pretty much off the bat, as soon as we put out the call, we realized that we had kind of caught the wave at exactly the right time. I think it was an educated guess on our part. We've been watching some really incredible speculative fiction popping up from all parts of South Asia. And, I think that there are maybe some established hotspots, so to speak, and I think some new ones. I think that, Sri Lanka, for example, I think the last few years there's been so much more coming out than there was before. So then, of course, Sri Lanka is not alone in that. But I think, yeah, we saw that we had really sparked a lot of interest, I think, just in terms of the number of submissions that we saw and the kind of excitement and feedback that we were getting from people. And yeah, I think that today's turnout, and also I should say today's panel, I think reflects that. I won't go too deep into the introductions now. Of course, we will introduce all of our panelists in more detail, but I do want to say that I think that between the three of you and also Gautam, who's on his way and about to join, I think we have some both established heavy hitters, but also I think some established champions. Some established champions of speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, all of those genres that I think in South Asia maybe have not gotten their due, but I think that right now, this moment, including our Fiction Fest, is part of an effort to put that right and to really put this front and center in terms of all the writing, all the creativity, all the publishing, Karthika, as well, that's happening in South Asia. So yeah, with that, just want to say a big thank you again to the panelists. We have another panel, and we've got a full 2 weeks of fiction coming up. The first story is already up on our website. Please go and visit at himalmag.com. I can tell you that we had a really, really large and really strong and really interesting field of submissions to choose from. We had a lot of fun reading all the submissions because I think, yeah, people can really surprise you with their imaginations. And the 6 stories that we picked, it was a tough choice, but we've picked some real gems, I think. And that's not so much thanks to us, that's thanks to the amazing writers who wrote those things and gave us the pleasure of publishing them. So thank you to those writers as well. Thank you to all of our panelists. And most of all, thank you to all of you for being here, for reading, and for being as excited as we are about speculative fiction and science fiction and all of this new writing that's coming out in South Asia. So I'll hand over to Shweta, one of our associate editors who anchors all of our work on books, but also an entire world of literary newsletters and podcasts and everything else. So yeah, Shweta, over to you.
Thank you, Roman, and welcome everyone. Echoing what Roman said, this edition of Himal's Fiction Fest is really exciting because South Asia has such a rich literary tradition of imagining its futures. And today we're seeing an incredible wave of emerging South Asian voices in the genre, writers who deserve a lot more exposure and recognition. And that's where Himal comes in. For years, Himal has been championing South Asian fiction and has been a home for so many great writers who have gone on to do amazing things. For example, Deepa Bhasthi, who was a part of Himal's Fiction Fest this time last year, recently won the International Booker Prize for her translation. It's a proud moment for us at Himal and also for the region because it's a reminder of how far South Asian fiction can travel. And at Himal, we have dedicated the South Asia Review of Books newsletter and podcast to spotlighting these writings and ideas that the region has to offer. So, if you'd like to support our work and the work that goes into making conversations like this possible, please consider becoming a paying Himal patron for just $5 a month. You can also support the newsletter by signing up through the link below in our chat. The first story of the Fiction Fest went live this morning, and next Monday we've got another exciting conversation on caste, gender, and resistance in South Asian speculative fiction. You'll find the link to register for that below as well. And please help us spread the word and keep an eye out on our website and social media channels as we bring you what I think is some of the most exciting speculative fiction that South Asia has to offer. And before we continue, I also just want to say a big thank you to Anthony Chen, who has been working tirelessly behind the scenes to bring this Fiction Fest together, from working on the stories, events, and everything in between. Anthony, thank you so much for all the work. And like Roman said, it's wonderful to have so many familiar faces and friends of Himal with us. Thank you all for being here. And a few housekeeping notes. Please keep your mic muted unless you're speaking. This helps everyone hear the panel clearly. And feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts, links, or questions during the session. And this conversation is being recorded and will be made available later on Himal's YouTube channel in case you'd like to revisit it or share it. And now for today's conversation on the state of speculative fiction in South Asia, we have the Pakistani American speculative fiction author of Midnight Doorways, Usman T Malik, the publisher at Westland Books, Karthika V K, and Theena Kumaragurunathan, the Sri Lankan author and the award-winning novel First Utterance. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's conversation, the lawyer, legal scholar, science fiction author, and editor, Gautam Bhatia. Gautam, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My apologies for being slightly delayed. I was stuck in a very terrible traffic jam, but I'm here now. So thanks so much, and thank you for doing this. And I think that this is a really great panel for to have this discussion because we have here speakers who really straddle the gamut of South Asian speculative fiction writing, editing, and working in across different media. So of course, like Usman is not only an acclaimed writer, but also is involved with the organization of the Salam Award, which tries to bring there's this culture of conventions and honoring work to South Asia, which is so important in just constructing institutions around which the genre can evolve and grow. And Tina is someone who works across media, not just the written word, but across different kinds of media. And of course, Karthika is an editor and really a champion of South Asian speculative writing. Other than beginning the If imprint, which is the first English language imprint dedicated to publishing spec fic. She's also working with me right now on an anthology of Indian science fiction writing. So I think like we have here people who can goes across the gamut of different kinds of writing. So I think that the first thing I'll begin by asking is that it's in the last decade or so, we have seen what you may think of as, a Chinese science fiction boom, where, you have suddenly Chinese science fiction works in translation breaking through into the English language market. You've seen the rise of African spec fic, both Afrofuturism and African futurism, and that has grown of late. And so I thought to begin by asking, have you seen a similar kind of evolution or a change in South Asian spec fic writing over the last, say, decade or so? You have been active in this space. And of course, it's also to say, of course, South Asia is itself a bit of a construct, right? Like, it's not one entity. Within South Asia, you have different countries where some countries, I think, unfairly dominate the conversation, including, India for sure. And of course, within these countries, you have diversity. I mean, India itself is composed of so many different languages, ethnicities, indigenous peoples, and so much more. So, of course, keeping in mind that South Asia is itself that, just to begin by asking, what evolution or changes have you seen over the last decade or so? And perhaps I'll just begin with what is clockwise on my screen. So if Theena could start, and then Usman, then Karthika.
So I think one of the questions that bounds all of South Asia is our, the fact that we were all colonized at some point. And that has left scars on us that are both tangible and intangible. And I feel, and my reading of speculative fiction, especially when it comes from your non-mainstream speculative fiction, whether it's outside of the Americas and the Europes, all of such speculative fiction aims to answer the question of why some of our nations are, broken in certain ways. If that might sound like a strong word, but it's most of our societies are broken in certain ways, and most of that fracture can be traced to our colonial past. And I feel like a lot of the speculative fiction that's coming out right now, especially in the last decade or so, has been an attempt at answering that question. And certainly that's true for my case. And I feel like when I read some of the work that's coming from, my compatriots, contemporaries rather, in Sri Lanka and across the island, across the ocean, one of those undercurrents feels like those authors attempting to answer those questions. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Usman, you want to take over?
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? Please let me know if you can't. It's very nice to meet you all and see you all, and thank you so much for the invite. Yeah, so I think as writers, post-colonial and peri-colonial wounds and wounding and memories of that wounding is inescapable. And unfortunately, that colonization runs in our bone marrow as much as the music and the ghazals of South Asia do. So we are made of blood and fire and music at the same time, unfortunately. And I have been telling some of my friends this, for the last 2 years, it's been difficult for me to read fiction because of multiple reasons. Of course, the big one, the elephant in the room, is the genocide that's happening, that we're all finding very difficult to prevent. I've just been reading mostly history and Indian history and Pakistani history and South Asian history. So right now, this is the right time for this panel for me, because I have so many questions about my own identity. I absolutely think that colonialism, and just not the British colonialism, Western colonialism and, empire, basically empire, the shadow of empires looms large over all of us. I think a lot of our fiction and a lot of our non-fiction and our self-interrogation revolves around those wounds and those questions. In my daily life, I'm a doctor, I'm a medical doctor, and I deal with a disease called fibromyalgia, which is chronic pain syndrome. And one of the biggest causes of chronic pain syndrome is childhood trauma. The psychic wounds that we experience become physical wounds for a lot of people. It breaks brain synapses in children, And these adverse as we call them ACE events, those adverse childhood events, basically define us as people. And I think that's true for our literature. Our literature is engulfed, it's entombed in those memories. And so all of our, I've recently been moving away from a lot of ideas of who I was when I lived, when I still live in the West. Right now I'm in Pakistan, I'm in Lahore, but mostly I live in the US. And so for me, those dual identity questions become very hard to answer. So I've been kind of moving away from a lot of Western constructs and trying to redefine myself. And in that way, I think speculative fiction, for me, the term has become very problematic because it's such a Western imposition on us. Had we not been writing speculative fiction for 2,500 years, maybe 2,000 years, maybe longer, we have been. So I think what we are writing is our own fiction, which we are speculating even on our own existence as peoples. And if I please stop me if I go a little longer, but I would just like to add one more thing about some interrogation that I've been doing recently of myself. Pakistanis, we are not Pakistanis per se. We are Pakistani Indians, right? So the river Indus flows through Pakistan now. And so we are Pakistani Indians, and our erasure of our identities has been very problematic for us. So our Indianness has been taken away from us. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. So I'm at a point where I really don't want to just limit ourselves to 75 years of history and give up my 5,000 years of history. So all my speculations revolve around these questions of identity and what we would do post-wounding and post-healing. Those are the questions that interest me the most right now.
Yeah, Karthika, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking that from the kind of publishing and the kind of books that we've seen coming out of India in the last, decade more, there's been so much of what if in it, but a lot of that has gone towards interrogating past mythologies and histories, and it's not the Western look ahead and imagine a future with technology being such an important part of it, etc. kind of fiction. It's so much of it has been as though everything has already happened, and all we need to do is to go back and discover or reinterpret, and we will find all the eternal truths in there. There is a sense of, because I kept thinking, why are we not able to find more sort of speculative science fiction sort of book titles in English, particularly in India? And over again, writers seem to be doing this, which is they're not so interested in the future as in the past. So that's been a bit of a problem, I think, for the evolution of SF in India. But I also think sometimes that particularly this time seems conducive to now looking ahead, because so much is out of control. Our politics, our world is out of control. And in that chaos, it feels like a writer trying to reimagine or imagine a future, which takes on that question of what if differently. For instance, we've seen like this anthology of writing on caste, and caste as a factor in the way you reimagine the world, an anthology that was published by Blaft recently, this Indian publishing house. And I think there are so many political and social issues in India, in the subcontinent, that perhaps you cannot sort out in the present. You cannot even imagine a more equitable life in the present. So perhaps our speculative fiction imprint is going to find a richness in that vein of looking to rebuild hierarchy, rebuild futures, so that it moves away into a kind of settling into a kind of specfic that is uniquely ours. And by that, I suppose I mean subcontinent and South Asian, because so many concerns and similar futures and past present themselves to us. So I'm actually quite excited. As Roman said, this is a good time for specfic. And I think this may be a time when we move away from all the Western models of how it should be done to finding our own voices and telling these stories, so that maybe we'll find a word for it that's different from speculative fiction. But it is supremely exciting at this point.
Yeah, in fact, that reminds me, Comma Press has this plus 100 series, right? They have Palestine plus 100, they have Iraq plus 100, they have Kurdistan plus 100, and I think Egypt plus 100, and they're bringing out the next one pretty soon, where they invite people from that country to imagine what life would be 100 years after a specific event. So for Iraq plus 100, it's 100 years after the invasion, 2003. For Palestine, it's 100 years after the Nakba, so 2048, and so on. So, so there is that specifically future-looking, work that takes the past and then tries to imagine future, and you see all kinds of interesting things being done in that context. So yeah, I think like just so I think all of you have mentioned our colonial history and how that informs present day writing and reception of work, especially in the speculative genre. I want to take that, but also perhaps add a little bit of a wrinkle to that because often when South Asian spec fic is presented, to the West, it's often presented as this, coming from this formerly colonized, now post-colonial, place, and that's sort of the way that it's looked at. But I think what that often fails to understand is this idea of internal colonization, right? And this idea that within each of these post-colonial nation states, you have not only social and economic inequalities, but also you have, various kinds of political coercion, political separation, and that's true both in the relationships between the countries of what is now modern day South Asia, but also within those countries. So, for example, in India, if you write, you cannot but reckon with Kashmir, for instance, and the same goes true for other countries as well. So, as South Asian speculative fiction writers, editors, publishers, who come from countries which, on the one hand, you have this history of colonization and anti-colonial movements, but on the other hand, you have much of that logic of colonialism often being turned upon the people within these nation states. So how do you think that should and has to be reckoned with? And I'll just reverse the order now. I'll begin with Karthika and then go to Usman and then Theena.
When you talked about Kashmir, it occurred to me that one of the things that I think speculative fiction can do so powerfully is being able to speak about things that are becoming unspeakable. When it's getting harder for publishers to be able to put books out there, or for writers to put books out there that actually take on the politics of our times head first, then why not speculative fiction? Why not use the genre to speak and to fight the battles that you can't fight in the present? I think that is really going to be why a lot of us are going to turn to writers and say, okay, you can do this, but you cannot do that. Why not break the rules and say, this is how we're going to fight this particular battle? And I'm seeing that some of it is beginning to happen, but really not very much writing in India at the moment, especially in the English language, is doing enough. And I feel that we really can expand this horizon of ours. It's very, very nascent at the moment. I don't know how you all feel about this, but to me, it feels like a small drop in the ocean of writing. There is almost like this feeling that speculative fiction is esoteric, is not necessarily real in some ways, that it is time pass in some other context. So there's a lack of seriousness that we are not able to communicate about this genre to our own book publishing ecosystem. And therefore, I think there are all these different angles to what you said, Gautam, about what we can do and are doing at the moment in this context.
Can we expect the Kashmir plus 100 as the next if book?
Yeah, well, this month has been a struggle because we have these two books that came out in exactly the same time as, this whole war situation. And there was so much stress about putting out a book there that says something about Kashmir at this time. You never know what anyone's going to make of it. So it's a very real problem at the moment. So yeah, maybe that's the way to go.
Yeah, Usman?
Yeah, so, you know, I wish I had the habit of making notes as people spoke so I could kind of, respond and come up with something more coherent, but I often don't. I will say a couple of things. Number one, I think all of us must first put out, or at least I must put out a disclaimer for myself and, the kind of fiction that I do. English, whilst it may be a colonial language, is still not a language that belongs to a lot of us. I think of English literature, especially from Pakistan, often as literature of exile, because we've been exiled and displaced from our own indigeneity in our own language. So I did not grow up writing and reading in English. I was not privileged enough to be very comfortable in an English-speaking household. I grew up very proficient in Urdu, and I wrote in Urdu for the longest time. And that writing was more authentic and it was purer in some ways than my English writing has been. So I wanted to put that out there. For me, my fiction in English is the fiction of an exile, is self-exile in some ways. So I wanted to put that out there. And so a lot of, Musharraf Ali Farooqi, a friend of ours, often says that the best literature in Pakistan is still coming in regional languages. It's not coming out in English. And I do believe that's true to some extent. There is a particular continuity and purity in regional languages that, try as I might, I am not able to convey in English. And I feel the distance. There is a translocation that's missing. So that's one thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of languages. So which is why it's kind of segues into my second point about speculative fiction. It's kind of interesting for me. The future is almost always a doppelganger of the past. There is this mirroring happening almost always. And I have written some hard science fiction, as we call it, which even though I'm a scientist actually, I'm a rheumatologist, I deal in autoimmune disease. My brain doesn't work that way though. My brain keeps insisting on digging up and exploring folklore and mythology. And when I teach writing students, I talk about stealing from the past. Just like in, Desi in the Indiana Jones, and steal all the stories you can, dig them up, and then you do whatever you want to do with them. Utilize them, reuse them, remodel them, create new templates. So those are a couple of things that I had. I'm sure there are other points that I'm probably now not remembering.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Theena, do you want to carry on from there?
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick up on something both Karthika said as well as Usman. Karthika's point about the nicheness of speculative fiction. And I think part of the reason is most readers think of it as this disconnected reimaginings of fictional worlds and having little or no relevance to our, lived plights and so on and so forth. But those of us who have read speculative fiction know that that is not the case. Science fiction is not necessarily about the future. It is a warning of the present, right? And horror has never been about ghosts and zombies and vampires. It's always been social commentary that's been embedded into the narrative in itself. And I think it's taking a little longer for our readers to make that connection. And I think part of that comes because of the publishing landscape. There is a certain, preference for stories from our region that is associated with the search for identity in a very real setting, where your readers can kind of be immediately able to relate to the situation or relate to the characters in a very straightforward kind of way. I'm not saying the fiction in itself is straightforward or simplistic. I'm just saying the hooks themselves are straightforward and simple enough that there's no need for the reader to make this almost a cognitive and imaginative leap with the writers. And I think a lot of these readers are not haven't been prepared for that kind of reading, because we emphasize the very realist, the very when I say post-colonial Southasian writing, we all know what that kind of book is, what that kind of narrative that's going to be there. And because we've been trained to just seek those out, because those are the books that get the attention, those are the books that get the loudest conversations, the most consistent conversations, it's becoming a self-fulfilling cycle, as I feel. It is only in the last 10, 15 years where I have felt that we as both a literary ecosystem have begun to look beyond that. And as something like Karthika said earlier as well, it's reimagining our past, but also reimagining our future using a lot of the myth and folkloric elements that have been, in some cases, completely wiped away from us because colonial education tells us that it's reason and a certain kind of education towards employability as opposed to understanding the roots from which you came. All of those things are missing in our general engagement with our past. And that kind of starts showing, especially in our current literary landscape. That's number one. And then number two, I was just thinking about what Usman said about English being not necessarily the language that is best utilized to sometimes convey these emotions, the highly complex emotions that we have, because the language itself was the colonizers' language. It was not our language, the colonized, right? And therefore, I think we sometimes struggle to make that connection with the English language in itself. Speaking personally for me, when I think speculative fiction, I come from a background that is both science fiction and magic realism. So for me, the two authors who truly when I was growing up, I was reading a lot of Arthur C. Clarke. I would probably have gone through pretty much all of Arthur C. Clarke by the time I was 18. And I was finding reading, English literature extremely tiresome and boring at that point in time. And it wasn't until I read Marquez and Latin American writing from the 60s that I felt like everything had been liberated. Like I felt like the language in itself had been liberated. And as I kind of learned about what's, like even Marquez's own reaction to how Spanish had been translated into English language, one of the things that struck me was, wow, what is it that we are not doing that we can't express our writing in our own native languages and that have it translated that way in itself? That's one thing. The other thing that speculative fiction does, especially, again, I learned this from Marquez, was social commentary in the form of world building. Macondo was Colombia, but it was Colombia compressed to this tiny little village, right? And that's one of the things that I took away. So in my fictional work, what I've been trying to do is to kind of compress Sri Lanka into this world that I can explore. Because for me, the question that I have always been trying to answer for the longest time is, why is it that that Sri Lanka is both impossibly blessed and cursed in equal measure? And I haven't found the answer to that. And for me, that is the answer that I'm trying to seek out through my writing. And it's probably something that I'm never going to kind of answer, but that is the what is it? That is the artistic motivation on my end.
Yeah, I think that this is really interesting because you mentioned identity, and it reminded me of something which also I think speaks to the conversation we are having. So a few years ago at Strange Horizons, the magazine I work with, we did a Palestine special issue, speculative fiction, and one point that was made in the editorial to that was that if you are a Palestinian writing speculative fiction, the expectation is that you will be writing about being occupied, genocide, genocide that goes back to the founding, of the state of Israel and so on. And that is basically, you're supposed to create your spec fic out of that material, and that in some sense is a trap. And what the editorial wrote was that, I mean, I don't want to be a Palestinian writing about the Nakba. I want to be a Palestinian writing about Deep Space Nine, Star Trek, right? So why is it that it is, the assumption is that when it comes to these, in speculative fiction and science fiction, these grand themes of space operas, of the far future, of these universal questions, around all these, topics and issues, that is in some ways still the preserve of predominantly white writers who can liberate themselves from their immediate context and write about these grand themes. When it comes to the non-white world, and in that case it was Palestine, and in this case it's South Asia, or these countries, the expectation is that in some ways you remain trapped in that history of yours. And it's basically, that is what you're expected to write about, and are limited to that. So again, so it's an Indian or a Pakistani or a Sri Lankan or a Bangladeshi or a Bhutanese or a Nepalese writer will be writing about, again, and even if they write futurism, it will be in some way trapped by or informed by that specific past, but not, say, an Indian Deep Space Nine, or a Pakistani, Strugatsky Brothers type novel, right? Of course, you do have writers like Saad Hussein, who does fantastic, cyberpunk and so on. So it does happen. But I was wondering what the three of you would think about that idea that, there could be a South Asian speculative fiction that, of course, you're obviously always coming from a context, yes, but which isn't necessarily bound or limited or trapped by that context, but is free to imagine, futures that have nothing to do with the present, are completely outside the scope of the territorial boundaries of South Asia, and deal with, these kinds of in a certain sense, eternal questions. So I'll just again scramble up the order. Usman, you want to go first, and then Karthika, and then Theena.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad that you posed that question, because I had made notes finally now about something that I was thinking about earlier. Absolutely, I don't think anyone should ever feel trapped. I agree that a lot of our fiction has to do with identity, with our own geography, with our own colonial trauma. But I don't believe, and I've talked about this with students as well, I don't believe that Pakistani or South Asian writers should limit themselves to any sort of identity literature. I don't think that is necessary at all. And I'd like to point out a towering example of that, right? So Ted Chiang, right? So Asian American writer, but if you read Ted Chiang's fiction, I'm not sure how much of his fiction is interlaced with his identity, except as a human being fascinated by cosmic questions. And this allows me to give a quote that Ted often quotes to students, which I think would be maybe interesting to some of our audience. When people ask Ted what his best advice for students of writing is, he quotes an excerpt from Annie Dillard, from an essay that Annie Dillard wrote in 1989, from an article called Write Till You Drop. And I'm going to paraphrase the line. The line is, there's some things that interest you and only you, but you've never seen that on the written page or on the big screen because no one else finds that interesting. And that is where your responsibility as the artist begins. And the line is, you were made and set here to give voice to your own astonishment. So people are astonished by different things. We are impassioned by different things. And some people's brain is different from others. Right? So some people are mesmerized by technology. Some people are mesmerized or forced to retreat into history, right? And forced to retreat into their own trauma to deal with the ongoing trauma of the world. And so I think that whatever you gravitate to, whatever you think impassions you the most, that you've never seen anyone else do before, I think that's where our journey as artists begin. And that astonishment could be disbelief at the state of the world, or it could be astonishment at what LLMs are doing, or the interface of AI with the modern world, and how quickly it's devouring everything, like Pac-Man, right? As funky and as useless as Pac-Man. So, those are some of the things I was thinking about. I also kind of wanted to go back to a question. You guys asked a really good question about, or made a comment that in India, speculative fiction still seems to be maybe a little more considered, and I could be wrong, but it implied that maybe it was being treated as still as ghetto literature in some ways, compared to maybe mainstream literature. I think, interestingly, what I have seen in the last decade in Pakistan is different. I do think that in Pakistan, there is a little bit more democratizing of literature. There is a little bit more growth of speculative fiction as a pretty valid and legit mode of expression. while it has not broken through on a major Booker or Pulitzer level, but I think it's getting there. So I just thought that some of the audience might find that comment interesting, and feel free to disagree.
Yeah, I think just to briefly interject on that, I feel like there is a lot of work that's awarded internationally, and that is speculative fiction, but is not marketed as such. And the book I'm thinking of is The Seven Moons of Maria Almeida, which for me has literally all the tropes of SF, but for obvious reasons is not. Would it have won the Booker had it been, published as SF? Maybe not, right? So I think like there is a lot of South Asian SF that is awarded across the world, but for obvious reasons is not classifying itself, as such. But I think this is thought I had on what you said. Karthika, just to continue with you on that.
Yeah, if I may pick up on that point of writing and publishing, the ecosystem that you spoke of, I think one of the problems with publishing fiction, reading fiction here has always been, in English that is, that validation has come for a lot of people from the West. It's come from literary agents in the West. And I mean, it's a simple matter of money and economics, right? You get published in the UK or the US, it's a very different advanced structure. It's a very different money. It's a different conversion of currency, and that's it. So there is every reason to hope that you will get published in the UK or the US, and less so maybe in Europe, where there is less familiarity with how things work. So you always end up, and there are these little instances of the occasional writer who makes like stupendous money and wins big awards. And so I know for a fact that a lot of writers in the languages, and this I'm talking about maybe 15 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, where they felt that if a book written in any Indian language, unless it went into English and was translated and published in English, and then of course in international spaces, it somehow wasn't quite doing what it could do. I'm not saying it's not enough, because obviously there are thriving publishing and writing worlds in many languages. But there was always that one more step to be climbed, and then it could be complete. Partly because, again, the money was very, very different. So that location, that center of power being the West, there is also the expectation of one kind of story. And over again, we see editors turning books down saying, but that's not the India we know or we want to read about, right? You tell them happy stories about happy things. That's not India. Difficult things? Yeah, sure. Let's look at it. So that expectation then means that writers also tend to want to somewhere fit into that international stream and flow with that. So that has been a problem. I think a lot of things changed when Indian publishing became a little bit more diverse, a little bit richer, a little bit more able to compensate bestsellers in India. So there was that change. But I think where literary writing is concerned, and where spec fiction and other genre fiction is concerned, the eyes are still very much on the West. And you know what we said earlier when the introduction to this panel was happening, we spoke about Heartlamp winning the award, the International Booker, and how wonderful it is for our region. I'm one of those who constantly sees the other side to that, which is why, until a big prize comes along, does a book not even sell its first print run? Why does it take an international prize like that for it to instantly now become a bestseller forever? We do not have the confidence to even validate our own taste in writing and reading, or to do that effectively enough to persuade our own readers that we need to care about what we write and read and publish without necessarily having that award do that for us. So it's a very mixed bag of, that ecosystem we're talking about has so many things that prevent really adventurous writing from taking shape here. That's what I wanted to add to this.
And you're doing a great job in trying to change that, with the imprint and all of that. Let's hope it makes some headway. Theena, please go ahead.
I mean, I can only speak from my position. When I finished First Utterance, one of the hardest things that I had to get through into the publishing ecosystem in Sri Lanka was because the novel was structurally different, it was thematically different, it was narratively also hadn't touched that whole post-colonial Sri Lankan literature narrative that it needed to. So one of the questions that I kept fielding was, could you rewrite this? Could this fictional country become obviously Sri Lanka? Could it become, could all the world building be stripped away and you make it a lot more recognizably Sri Lanka? And I kept hearing that for a few years, actually. I mean, to a point where I genuinely thought maybe this doesn't work. And it was only after I was actually convinced by a bunch of well-wishers to self-publish it that I took the trouble to actually go down that path and see for myself if I start this publishing thing and just release it, would I have to kind of obviously navigate the whole specter of this being a vanity publication. I had to like overcome that part as well. And this was back in 2016 when you in the whole Amazon independent publishing ecosystem, you had vanity publishing just exploding at this point in time. So I didn't want to, be associated with that, but I knew at the same time, if I kept waiting for a publisher who would finally get the manuscript, I would probably waste a few more years. So that was the reason I actually went that path, and I essentially created my own publishing firm to release my own book. And when that validation came, I was as surprised as pretty much anyone else, because I really didn't expect the literary landscape here to even resonate with that in any way or form. So that was great. So I think that is a sign of things slowly but surely changing over time. I also want to just piggyback on something you said, Gautam, about some of us just want to write stuff about Star Wars and Star Trek, and we have no chance to do that because we are supposed to be writing a certain kind of fiction, right? I'm a filmmaker as well on the side, and one of the pieces of work that really resonated with me over the last few years is a series called The Expanse. And one of the reasons The Expanse works so well is, number one, its head writer is Southasian, Naren Shankar, right? So that was one of the things. The other thing is the entire world is so incredibly informed and fueled by not necessarily the hard sciences, but also social science. So there's linguistics coming into it. So you find humans who have kind of moved out, started colonizing the other planets within the solar system and not outside the solar system. So that as humanity kind of goes outside planet Earth into Mars and so on and so forth, you find the languages slowly evolving. You find a Creole that emerges from the outer planets. You find Martians speaking a very different version of the common tongue. All that was great, but one of the other stuff was it also, everything from its costumes was informed by, like, one of the lead characters is almost always, she's South Asian, played by an Iranian lady who was always walking in with the most glorious saris that I've ever seen, right? And like the very fact that I saw someone of a non-white background who was one of the most influential characters dressed in sari and having such a meaty part, that was one of the most exciting things that I've seen in a long time. I would like to see that in the literary side as well, and I think we are like, maybe it's slowly moving towards that, but the sooner we do, the more exciting things that we can experience, because there's so much of material inside our South Asian cultures that would make for perfect world-building material in such context, whether that is like a Star World context or Star Wars concept world or a Star Trek world. In all those cases, it being informed by some of our cultural conventions would just make those worlds richer, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say +1 on The Expanse. Other than the hard science, of course, the critique of political economy in The Expanse is just like fantastic. I think it's so good. And yeah, Christian Avasarala also recently, speaking of costumes, had some great costumes. Same actor in The Wheel of Time. Unfortunately, now been cancelled, but that is how we go. So Roman and Anthony, should we do a round of questions now? Should we go around and take a few questions and have the panelists answer them?
Yes, and Shweta, actually, would you jump in on that one, I think, to run the show?
Yeah, will do. For everyone listening, please either drop your questions in the chat below or just raise your hand and we'll hand the mic over to you.
I'll start if that's okay. Going back to a point, actually, I mean, and a super interesting one, right? I mean, like all our literature is magical realism. I mean, before there was, well, I'm talking about all the historical literature, right? So much of it is fantasy, is speculative fiction. And now again with I think speculative fiction getting center stage more and more. I'm curious for the panel and Gautam, this includes you because you're a writer and a published speculative fiction novelist yourself now. Are there things that you think that this mode of telling, both historically and now, here and today, lets us say, or questions it opens up for us that you don't think that, let's say, the more mainstream genres really gave us room for?
Would it be okay if I jump in quickly and maybe say a couple of words about that? Okay, all right. I was just gonna say, I often, I give an apologia for speculative fiction to the literary people sometimes, even though we really don't need to do that anymore. But anytime someone asks me that question, I always go back to E.M. Forster's Aspects of the Novel. You know, one of the classicists, right? So in his Aspects of the Novel, he actually has this image that has always stuck in my head, where he talks about dream time being so important in literature. You know, 1/3 of the human condition is sleep. So literature that doesn't deal with sleep logic or dream logic is literature that's not dealing with 1/3 of the human condition. So anytime when it comes to speculative fiction and magic realism and folklore, you know, for me, it sort of becomes this idea that it is part of the human condition. And this is why I'm interested in that. And it allows me to answer, you know, it goes back to that Le Guin quote, right? Science fiction is not predictive, it's descriptive. So it allows me to describe the world with alternate ways of envisioning the world. It allows me to use myth and folklore and technology, right? And technology and magic and mishmash them to create answers that, or maybe even questions, not necessarily even answers. So that's the comment that I wanted to make.
Yeah, and perhaps just to add to that, I think just in response to the question, for me, one of the wonderful things about spec fic, which mainstream literary fiction can't do, is that speculative fiction can change one thing or two things about the world that we take for granted, and then ask what if, and then that reflects back, upon the world that we inhabit. So just the famous story Nightfall, where there is a planet which has six stars. It's encircling six stars, and so people have never seen the night, they've never seen the stars. And then once in 2000 years, when the stars align literally in a way that night falls, how will that society react to, for the first time in living memory, the stars being in the sky? And that story uses that, something as basic as the night and stars, and by taking that away, it just tells us so much about the way that we react to things, to the other, to strangeness. And I think that that's something that speculative fiction does so well, and it's what it's about, and that's what the mainstream literary fiction can't do. And that is why I love writing, and I will always write SF. So yeah.
May I just add something to this, as someone not a writer, but someone looking at this? I feel like writers of speculative fiction in our part of the world in particular, it feels like a very difficult thing that you guys have embarked on, in the sense that look at the way in which we teach science in our schools. Look at the way in which we do not prioritize imagination in our education system, and how kids come out looking for utility as, or survival, or climbing ladders, or whatever. Those are the things that one prioritizes, right? There is a very, very small part of our society of writers who say, I want to take a different path and I want to do something very differently. And I wonder, how do you locate yourself in this then? Where is the tradition, the lineage within which you say, I'm a spec fic writer, and these are the ones who came before me? And that's and I'm going towards this, I'm taking this path, etc. But is this like, so where do your sources come from for this lineage? They come from different parts of the world, but perhaps not in your immediate world. So isn't it like really lonely? Isn't it really hard? And does not feel sometimes that you're ahead of your time and really you are going to have to wait for appreciation to come much later? Is it difficult, is what I want to ask you.
Difficult, yes. I don't know if it. I will also say that it was lonely, but it's getting a. We have company now, which is great. Like this very panel is a sign that there is a community out there. So to answer the very first question, what makes me what makes speculative fiction resonate with me? It's simply like. It to me, the only avenue that I feel can answer the question that I am most obsessed with. Why, like as I mentioned earlier, why is it that this country, Sri Lanka, is so equally blessed and cursed in equal measure? And the answer hasn't come from any of the fiction that I've read. Maybe I can think of three, Sri Lankan literary fiction pieces that have taken me a little closer to that answer. But otherwise, no. So to answer Karthika's question of why, it's only because I feel like it's the only vehicle that will take me as close as possible to that answer. Like I said earlier, I don't think I will ever have the answer to that question of why this country is as it is. But I know that that I've read enough South Asian literature to know that, or South Asian and Sri Lankan literature specifically to know that route isn't going to do it for me. I know that path isn't the path that will take me there. I know the path that I need to take is somewhere in the intersection between science fiction and magic realism. And that's the path which, I mean, you have a writer's instinct that comes from being readers for decades, right? And that instinct is telling me that route, that intersection between science fiction and magic realism, which to me is my idea of speculative fiction. That's the only way that I can answer that question. So that's essentially a long-winded answer to why spec fic for me.
So, I was thinking of the idea that the moment we ask that question, we are really suddenly kind of begging. We're kind of begging to define science fiction. Then, what is science fiction at that point? And one of my favorite definitions is, again, it comes from Ted because he's just smart that way. He can say things that I can't say. So he basically once said in an interview, science fiction is fiction that pushes at the boundaries of knowledge. And I think that's such a simple, easy question to what science fiction is and can do. So, the moment you said that you're ahead of your time, immediately, and we're all, I think most of our audience is South Asian, so I can take this liberty. I'm thinking of Ghalib, right? Main andalibe gulshane na afarida hu. I'm the nightingale of the garden that hasn't been born yet. And so I'm thinking of Ghalib in writing science fiction now. I'm thinking of Ghalib in reimagining the world. And for me, that anyone who's working with the Socratic method, anyone who's working by asking the next question, anyone who's interrogating is essentially engaging in thought experiments, very hard thought experiments. Science fiction is really at its very crux philosophical fiction. It's ontological fiction sometimes. So for me, I've never felt lonely because anytime I am writing science fiction, most of mine is fantasy, but if I am engaging with, with fantastical fiction, I have so much company in history. For me, in the words of Alan Moore, I love re-enchanting a disenchanted world. And that is what I enjoy doing more. I love creating new histories of a world that lost its glory and glamour a while ago for multiple causes. I like creating those histories and those questions, and then I like seeing where those questions lead me. So I honestly haven't felt lonely even from the very beginning.
We have a question from Kushbu.
Hi, thank you so much. Hello, I hope your day is going well. So my question is related to translation, actually, because you guys talked about how English is like, we talked about English being the colonizer's language, liberating it. But I've been thinking about how, myself included, and other speculative fiction South Asian writers that I know, because we are raised in a society which values English more than our native languages, a lot of us are not very well versed with our native languages. And the unfortunate part of that, I realize, since I am a part of the Sovereign, I hear about like our own local languages that were cut off from the long history of speculative fiction that we have in different native languages. So how do you think, like, I'd love to hear your perspectives on how could translation improve and change that? Because a lot of times when I meet younger writers, because they're aware of our own cultural history so far, I think that is also like them being deprived of the opportunity to kind of build upon a culture, right? So I'd love to hear everyone's perspective on that. Thank you.
I think maybe Karthika could talk a bit about attempts at IF and all to try and get some translations and try and actively reach out for translated works.
Yeah, I was just thinking actually today that maybe there is, and there are a few other projects that have happened, I know. But I was thinking even the classic Indian SF, say, or even South Asian SF, which was Bengali or Marathi or actually very few languages apart from those, I think, were invested in SF early. But even those, I mean, we have Tagore and we have all the classics in many other ways, but we don't really pay attention to retranslating or bringing out books or versions of previous classics like this. Because again, it feels like of all the work that these writers have done, their spec-fic work sort of sits on the sidelines a little bit. So there's a lot of excavation to be done. There's a lot of reorientation to be done, I think, before translations within this space at least take front of stage space. At the moment, it is sort of lingering somewhere. So there's a lot of work to be done, which is great. It's challenging that we should be able to do this.
Theena, do you have anything to say? Because I do want to make one comment.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, so I completely agree with Kushbu's question. I am the son of a Tamil writer, right? But one of the constant regrets that I have is that I've never been that I may have kind of inherited some of my dad's literary gifts, but it went into a completely different language and not into Tamil. And I am also in a country where Sinhala is the majority language. I couldn't speak Sinhala properly at least until I was, I'd say, 28. So for me, when I grew up, one of the things that kind of bedazzled me was seeing and meeting and hearing people who could switch between all three languages in a flash, and that seemed like magic at that point in time. And how that so now, in my 40s, one of the things that I am trying to address is to be able to read and write. I mean, I can read, but write in my native language in a way that is comparable to how I write in English. But I'm also trying to do the same with Sinhala as well. So the one of the novels that I'm working on right now is, I really do think it's a foolish endeavor, but I'm going to try and do it anyway. It's a trilingual novel. It's a spec fiction written in all three languages. Well, the English is the, like it's the pastry, the flour and all that stuff. But inside you get both Tamil and Sinhala kind of, put basically weaving the narrative together. So I think those are interesting places to go through, and that's one of the ways that I'm hoping to explore those very same questions.
So one of the things that historically I've talked about with other writers is in Urdu we don't have a huge amount of science fiction, or at least hard science fiction. We have a lot of speculative fiction, but not really hard science fiction. And part of the reason I wonder isn't the evolution of education in the Indian subcontinent, especially in Pakistan. And I think that partition was such a such a heavy wound that a lot of people were stunned by what it left behind and what it took away. And so I think that maybe a lot of writers were dealing with that, especially progressive writers in Pakistan were dealing with that in Urdu and regional languages, rather than thinking about science necessarily as something that was mandatory to literature. These days, I think if you're not engaging with science, you are writing escapist fiction because science invades and pervades every single part of your life. Anyone who's not dealing with the questions technology and science pose is just writing escapist fiction. You are writing in a bubble, basically. So I think in Urdu didn't even have the vocabulary really for science fiction for the longest time. There are some writers who've written, but not a lot of people. And I think that's what's been preventing translation from Urdu into English. Someone that I recently discovered is Mrs. Abdul Qadir. I don't know if people have heard of her. She was a horror writer in the 1930s. And she has written some amazing pulp fiction and some amazing literary fiction, actually. She has a very classicist style and very good writing skills, but she was following some pulp fiction tropes, which I thought was so fascinating. Almost like Egyptology sort of, stories, Oriental stories in Urdu. I've just found that fascinating. So Mrs. Abdul Qadir is someone to look up if people haven't read her work. Just wonderful work. And I think people are beginning to translate her stories if anyone is interested.
Mm. Can I just add that it's not just English now. Interestingly, in India, there has been in the past a lot of translation between languages, and English wasn't always the language in which everything was published. Then there was a phase, I think a longish phase, where everything had to go from one language to English and then to the world. But now we're seeing increasingly, like when you go to, say, Frankfurt to the book fair and so on, publishers will often come to you from Poland and Scandinavia and whatever, and they would say, we really want to publish from the languages. And English language fiction, as far as I can tell, has had its day. Nobody in the West seems to be particularly interested in Indian English writing anymore in the way that they're interested in what is coming in Tamil or Bengali or Malayalam or whatever. And sometimes it's very pragmatic sort of question as well. They will be like, I know one person who can translate from Tamil, so give me a Tamil book to translate into Polish or something similar. But English is not trendy. English is not in vogue anymore. And I think it's going to be a while before they get back to looking at English language fiction as being exciting for whatever reasons.
Should we take one more question before we wrap up? There's a question in the chat from Samyajyoti Mukherjee. She's asking, how do you deal with the burden of culture as a speculative fiction writer? Like, we have the various epics in India, and here we have Rabindranath or Nazrul or so on, and it often feels like every writer has to somehow justify their writing by linking it to that culture in some way. As a speculative fiction writer myself, that is stifling. I wonder what you all think.
I think maybe just to briefly come back on that. So I've recently been working on this long form piece about the history of Indian science fiction for a magazine. And one thing that really I found in my research was that there are multiple traditions of Indian science fiction or speculative fiction, and it's not just I mean, of course, the epics are always there and they always cast a long shadow, and we'll grow up with them. But like you have in the 19th century Bengali Kalpavigyan that then goes on. A lot of traditions in Maharashtra and Marathi science fiction. Rokia Shekhawat Hussain writes the first Indian English science fiction short story. Of course, you all know about that, The Sultana's Dream. And then you have colonial science fiction. You have post-independence, different streams, and so in that sense, you can choose to belong to any of them. Satyajit Ray was doing interesting work, and so it's not just the epics that of which cast a long shadow. There are just so many ways of being in South Asia in terms of speculative fiction that no one no one epic or no one work or no one writer should exert that kind of suffocating sort of anxiety of influence, because there's so much going on. And then you have global science fiction, which is just yeah, there's so much there to be a part of. So yeah, so I say that yeah, I mean, whenever you think that there is one tradition or like one work that is dominating, just remember that there's so much else going on which you can be a part of, and that'll be liberating.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to also just add that everyone should absolutely pick up Gautam's new SF novel. It's an incredible story combining anarchism, justice, science fiction, and so much more, published by Westland's very own imprint, If. Thank you, Gautam, and a big thank you to our panelists for a truly riveting discussion. And of course, thank you to our audience for engaging and for spending your Monday evening with us. We hope you'll join us for the rest of Himal's Fiction Fest in the coming weeks. And until next week, thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
It's
Have a
great
good night.
meeting you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.